We have to get to the point where the agent is actually an accepted team member that can contribute code. Today can help you to diagnose your problem. I think we are going to get to a stage where instead of me filing an issue, I just use Copilot and an NSV agent to make the change. I think we're heading into an era where people truly just provide apps for themselves that are just for them and their friends or their family.
So let's dive in and we'll talk about this. Thomas, I'm super excited that you're here and chatting with us. I feel like GitHub has been on a roll, has had a ton of incredible product releases over the last 6 months around AI. Can you just give us the lay of the land? I think people are super familiar with GitHub Copilot. It's been around for a long time. It's super widely used. What are the highlights as far as new product releases you all have been doing specifically in the AI space?
Oh gosh, that's so much to talk about. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here with you all. And it's been a journey for us since we started with Copilot. It's now almost 5 years ago, June 2020. Now, when we're recording this is February 2025. Back then we had GPT-3. We played with a model. We worked with OpenAI to fine tune a model that then was called Codex. And really, it was just auto completion, right? We brought AI into where developers are writing their code, predicting the next line, multiple lines of code, test cases, and really quickly it became very obvious that this is incredibly helpful for developers because they stay in the flow, right? Instead of you going, from your editor to the browser, and Nolan mentioned, before we started recording, how many tabs he has open, right? We all do. You get distracted by all the things that are happening in your browser. So by the time you're back to your editor and you're copy and pasting something, off of a blog or a Reddit post or GitHub, obviously, you lost that, train of thought that you had, or chain of thought, as we call it now in the models. And then came ChatGPT, right? And that changed everything for the industry. And obviously we brought chat into the editor, giving it all the context of all the files you have open, the debugger terminal. And then if you just look into the last, 6 months or so, it's become obvious that first of all, we're moving from one model to a set of models. And we have now in Copilot OpenAI GPT-4o and O1, O3 Mini now, and then O1 without Mini, and Claude 3.5 Sonnets, and since last week we also have Gemini 2.0 and Flash available. And just as on GitHub, right? We wouldn't run GitHub with just one open source library where you get React, and if you don't like React, well, tough luck, you have to go somewhere else. We believe that developers want choice, and they want all these models available and pick the right one, and they probably have their favorite model, and then once you started using it, you kind of figure out how it works, and you can kind of predict what it can solve and what it cannot solve. So that has fundamentally changed, I think, over the last 6 months. And just a couple of weeks ago with DeepSeek, the whole game has changed again, right? The second is that we're moving from kind of AI infused to AI native workflows and agents. And these agents are still in their early stages. And just last week we announced agent mode in VS Code, and so you can now not only ask questions and chat answers you how to solve that problem, it actually can generate files or modify files, and it can give you a command line commando, and then can say, okay, I want to run this, and if not, then not, right? So if it removes all your files, you can say, well, maybe not. let me try again. So it's still in control, but it shows you kind of that journey that we're on. I like to think about this as driver assistance systems in your car, right? As long as full self-driving only really works when you're in a Waymo in San Francisco, you need still controls like a steering wheel and need to pay attention, and the car tells you to pay attention, right? And same is true for these agents. While there is certainly that vision on the horizon where the agent can solve things on its own, in the meantime, we need these more agentic workflows where you as a developer stay in charge.
Yeah, and how do you think about, there's obviously tons of super interesting products being built in the space. GitHub is making some of those products. How do you think about what the opportunity is for GitHub to build some of this stuff versus problems you want to stay away from and let the rest of the ecosystem solve? And even from the browser perspective, obviously Copilot is a core part of VS Code, but VS Code is a a Microsoft product, if you will, or an open source product, if you will. Like it's not a GitHub
Yeah.
product. Like, how do you think about that tension as you're figuring out like what level of detail to go and build some of these experiences in?
VS Code is, in a way, our sister team within Microsoft. We're sitting in a new organization that just got formed about a month ago called Core AI. And so VS Code, GitHub, the regular Visual Studio .NET, and then the AI side with the Azure AI Service, AI Foundry, those things, we're all sitting in the same organization. So that kind of like describes, I think, the pieces that we want to cover, which is the AI stack from the infrastructure platform layer, if you will, responsible AI inferences, evaluations, to the IDE platform layer, extensions that you can build for VS Code or for GitHub, all the way up to the GitHub layer, if you will, the DevOps layer where your software development lifecycle exists. And then on top of, obviously, we're building a lot of tools that you can use to build your own applications on top of that stack. So, as of today, we are leveraging others to build these models, whether that's OpenAI, Claude, or Google, or DeepSeek. We have a whole model catalog. Obviously, Microsoft has some smaller models like 5.4 as well. But then on top of that, that's the stack that we're thinking we will cover. And some of that we do under the GitHub brand, some of that we do under the VS Code brand, and some of that we will do under the Azure or more generic Microsoft brands.
One of the questions that actually, like, Nolan and I spend a lot of time, and I don't know if me and Nolan have both worked at NumFocus for a really long time. I've been on the board. Nolan drives our sustainability efforts at NumFocus, and provides the financial legal infrastructure for open source projects like NumPy, SciPy, et cetera, et cetera. And we were actually last night, Nolan and I were having this conversation about open source sustainability and sort of where the world of AI goes to help and potentially like help augment the work that maintainers have to do. And I'm curious, like, I think GitHub has been in this position providing the sort of infrastructure, frontier infrastructure in many ways. Like you have done a bunch of grant programs and other things to help make open source more sustainable. And I'm curious, like, how the sustainability angle plays in with some of this AI tooling, specifically for the maintainers of a lot of these projects.
I think one of the biggest problems that maintainers face today is just as soon as your open source project becomes successful, which ultimately is the goal when you start working on open source, right? Like you have this idea of building something, then you make it open source, and you have that dream of getting some tractions, gaining stars, having others talk about your project, and ultimately it's a way for software developers to gain reputation or status, right? And the stars and the followers that you have on GitHub for many developers is as important as the number of followers that you have on X or Blue Sky or Mastodon or whatnot. And then your project becomes successful, and now you're flooded with issues and ideas and questions. And even if you're more successful, people forking your project and sending you back pull requests, and all of a sudden what you thought is amazing becomes a burden on your life, especially when it doesn't bring you a revenue stream, and when you never intended to make that a business because you love your job or you want to actually work on some other startup idea, right? That's what we often see in open source, is that those that are powering the internet, there's this meme, this graphic where it's kind of like a stack of blocks, and right there's this little piece of open source maintainer in, I don't know, Nevada or something, right? Like that, if that breaks apart like a Jenga tower, the whole thing falls apart. And so if you think about AI and agents, how will that help? Is that hopefully they can pick up some of these issues and help the maintainer do their work without going through each of these issues and figure out how to implement that. Is that actually valuable for me? It could be on the issue side by citing the issue. It could be just by automatically implementing that and creating a pull request and say, here, updated to the latest version of some open source library you're using. It could be in reviewing the code, that came from a fork through a pull request, and providing feedback to the person that forked your repo, right? So that way you have that feedback loop before the maintainer has to wake up and do that all manually. All the way to fixing security vulnerabilities and kind of like reducing the boilerplate that an open source maintainer has to naturally go through as the as the software survives for years, if not decades to come, right? Like that software is stale really fast. There isn't really much software that can just remain unchanged forever, and so you have to constantly keep maintaining the thing. And so leveraging AI for a lot of that, so you can gain back some time to do creative work, I think is the biggest impact that AI can have on open source. When we talk about this future of agents and of having a Jarvis in our ear or whatnot, we also have to be real that like a lot of problems are just very simple and we still haven't solved them. Like how often are you on a call and you're muted and somebody else will tell you, hey, Thomas, you're muted. How often is your internet connection unstable? How often do you work in code bases that are so outdated that the dream of AI modernizing all that is just still years away?
Yeah, I think that's such a great point. I think the other thing that this makes me think about is just like how much the sort of social contract of the internet relies on the idea that there's like another human at the end of some action that's happening. Like that is just like the fundamental reality of the internet, with the exception of like crawlers, which there's sort of a well established like internet substrate for like crawling infrastructure. And I think this is going to happen now with agents, where like, I can imagine a world where there's however many hundreds of millions of developers on GitHub, but there's actually like billions and billions of agents roaming around the internet, and like they're kind of like poking and prodding at a bunch of these different things. And I'm curious, like from a infrastructure standpoint, from like a social contract standpoint, also from like a security standpoint, like how do we navigate that world, especially when like so much of the like critical infrastructure for the world is now like living on GitHub with open source software.
I think the way, I'd like to look at this is that in many, regards, we already have that world, right? Like we're running millions of, CI/CD processes, automatic build processes, automatic testing processes, whenever we push code into a repository on a recurring basis. And in many ways, that's just nothing else than an agent, a simplistic agent, doesn't have a lot of intelligence, but, it reacts in an environment. You push code, it takes that code, it does something in a virtual machine, which is exactly what an agent does as well. It compiles this, it tries to figure out, go step by step, and these steps are hard-coded, while for the agent, they're somewhat variable. They're coming out of the model instead of out of a script, right? And then at the end, you get a log file and a result, and then you have to kind of like figure out if the result is not what you expected, what happened in the log file, and you scroll through that, which is exactly what, how these agents work when whether using ChatGPT or Copilot or agent mode, is like, as long as it works and your output is exactly what you expected, that's cool, right? Like as soon as it doesn't work anymore, now you have to scroll through endless lines of log files, which look no different today than they looked 20 years ago when you did make on a make file or configure and it didn't work. And so I think, in many ways, that's why AI is so successful for software development already, because we have been preparing us for that world by establishing processes like DevOps, Azure development, unit testing, quality gates, not pushing into the main branch without a human review and a pull request, CI/CD, all these kind of things, right? On the other side, I think we got to think about that future of agents where the agent needs to be predictable, right? Like I need to know before I spin off an agent whether the agent can actually solve the problem I have. Like you can today, go into Copilot and say, hey, build me the code for GitHub or Facebook or whatever Office. And it obviously won't do anything meaningful. It probably gives you something, and then you can iterate from that, but you quickly put yourself in a corner that you can't back out of, and then you're like, screw it, I start fresh, right? So it needs to be predictable, and so you need to know before I get started, because once I'm starting and the agent is running, I'm wasting compute, right? Like the longer this thing runs, the more money or time I have spent. Then it needs to be steerable, right? Like I need to be able to specify what I want combined with predictability in a way that I know what the output will be. And you often hear folks saying, the agents will replace the junior developer. And in my head, I'm like, well, but how long can I send a junior developer off to do a task until I want to check in with that junior developer and say what they've been doing, right? Like it's this feedback loop that is even more crucial for a junior developer than it is for a senior developer, right? So I need to be able to steer the agent I need to verify the output of that, right? So predictable, steerable, verifiable, and then it needs to be, I need to be able to tolerate it. Like it needs to be like in such a way that when I send it off and do some work and it comes back and files a pull request, which is something we showed recently, where you take an issue with an agent all the way to the pull request, and the pull request looks like a human would have filed it, except the Copilot filed it, right? That output needs to be tolerable. Like if I look at this and don't find that useful, and then have to basically give it so much input that in the time that the agent actually did the work, I could have done it myself, I will not use that again, right? And so these four things need to be all true until we are at the point where an agent can actually take over software development tasks. And so right now, that's very small tasks. And the more complex they get, the more you're wasting your time.
Yeah, something this makes me think of, and maybe this is a horrible idea, but I feel like the AI agents having this sort of a publicly visible GitHub contribution graph is actually like this kind of interesting eval that I think
Yeah.
like developers are really like when I see an open source pull request, like almost one of the first things I do is like, who is this person? Like, should I even spend the time to like invest into, merging this pull request, reviewing it, et cetera, et cetera. And I feel like that'd be an interesting mechanism to like assess the quality of the given stance of where AI is today. I'm curious if you all have pushed on that like contribution graph sort of publicly visible eval in order to ascertain like what is the actual capability of an agent today.
If I think about this, when you do it as a human, right, and I file a pull request against your project, and you don't like my code, you give me feedback, and then as a human, I'm able to adjust to your feedback, or I go away and say, well, Logan doesn't like my style, and I don't want to adjust, to his style, and so we part ways, and that often happens in open source as well, right? Certain communities have certain ways of collaborating, and folks that don't like that style go off and do their own projects, and often we then see also forks in the road for some projects. Agents, today don't have that feedback loop, right? Like you can give them feedback to kind of like steer them into the direction you want them, but like ultimately the agent doesn't have social behavior. They're not a team player. The gamification, of the team construct, where if you're the new developer in the team, the existing team members, set the standard for you, and in your first week or so on a project, you kind of like learn, and you're careful, of how you're landing within the team, because they're raising the bar for you until you made it, and that your pull request gets merged, right? So I think that's where, when we think about these agents, that's where we have to get to the point where the agent is actually an accepted team member that can contribute code. And today that happens right at the auto completion level, right? Like a very simple feedback loop where, while you see something and you press the tab key and accept the code, and then you can use the cursor or the mouse to edit that code, which is a learned behavior for software developers. As we've been doing that for as soon as the internet came. Actually, before the internet even came, you typed listings from magazines and books, right? And then you modified those listings and made them work within your application. And it was frustrating back then because you couldn't go and ask somebody else, whether a human or an agent, of solving a problem. And that's really the agent today can help you. The Copilot today can help you to diagnose your problem, and we didn't have that capability over the internet. So I think it's this learning of where these agents work today, and evolving them from that place is crucial, instead of jumping ahead into a future where you believe all the tasks, all the issues that you file can just be implemented magically by software and by a software or SWE agent. I think that's where the engineering challenge is today for us at GitHub.
Yeah, it's a conversation that, back to the conversation Nolan and I were having about sort of open source sustainability. One of the things we were talking about was how much the sort of input of a lot of these like code creation artifacts matters, like even more in the world of AI. I think like there's a lot of human intuition that goes into like, oh, I see a GitHub issue. It's like kind of opaque. The maintainer like put a bunch of random context that like maybe doesn't make a lot of sense unless you've worked on the project before or something like that. And then you sort of take in agent, which today I think like, all AI systems like start from zero. Like they have absolutely no context of this thing. Like they only have the context which is given to them. And like if the only context they have is this really opaque GitHub issue that like requires the nuance of some repo,
Yeah.
it's really hard for them to do an effective job. And I'm curious how you like how much of this is actually like an AI code generation problem versus like helping people do all the like, sort of traditionally described as like soft skill things that software engineering folks have to do, which is like document things well, write out a plan, have the interpersonal human connection between other people. How much of that is actually a product problem that still needs to be solved to make this like code generation use case work really well?
A lot of it, right? Like in many ways, the Copilot has the same challenges as the human. Most projects are large, and figuring out which files actually implement the current behavior and have to be changed for the new behavior of an issue is hard for a human, and it's hard for an agentic developer in the same way. Let alone that obviously the model has a limited context window, and then figuring out which parts to stuff into the prompt and which parts to leave out. That's still an unsolved challenge. And the larger the monorepo that you're working on, the harder that gets. And so since last year we have a product in development called Copilot Workspace that literally puts you as the developer still at the center of that agentic workflow. And so the first step when you file an issue is that it actually writes you a spec of the current behavior by analyzing the code that is in the repo. And so it's the bullets, describing previous state and new state based on your description. And then you can edit that. And so it's literally like a bulleted list in, I don't know, Notion or your note sheet, right? And you can just edit that bulleted list and say, well, that's actually not the behavior I wanted when I described the issue. It also has a brainstorming mode where can give you more ideas of what else you could do. And so when you think about just that step of that workflow, it helps you to write better issues. But it also then gives you a path to, okay, so plan out these changes in across all the files, and it shows you which files to modify. And you can say, well, add the README file and update that, or consider the files in the test folder, things like that, right? And then you can ask it to implement all the changes and run the thing, and works well for web applications, right? Because this is a flow that is in the browser with the cloud environment. So if you're working on a web-based application, you can just run the thing and look at the preview, and then you can file your pull request. So instead of you filing an unspecific issue, by starting with an issue and using Copilot Workspace, you can actually file a full-scale pull request that is based on the code base by the AI, the Copilot looking at the code base and your specification, helping you to that workflow. But you as a human need to steer it along the way. Like there's, if you go through that workflow, you quickly have to learn a new way of software development, where you have to read all this, all these descriptions that the AI, that the large language model, the agent, analyzed, and then realize, okay, here something is missing here, and I have to add something there. And so your engineering skills, your systems thinking, the decision making, what open source library to use, what database to use, all these skills, all that knowledge is still required. And so somebody with no computer science background or no coding background, not a programmer before, can't actually go through that workflow on a decent sized repository.
Thomas, kind of off that same thread, in your TED Talk, you mentioned that AI could enable 1 billion new developers by lowering entry barriers. So how is GitHub addressing the challenge of onboarding and educating this influx of new developers, especially those from non-traditional backgrounds?
Let me give you a couple of examples. And the one, my favorite example, and I mentioned it a bunch of times on stage already. I have, kids, my 2 sons, and they're learning coding in Python. And before Copilot, they would come, to my desk in the middle of a podcast and say, here's, my coding challenge, and find the bug in my code so I can keep going and building my game, because they're much more interested on the outcome of what they're building than the intricacies of software development. Right. And so then at some point it dawned on me, well, I could just get them Copilot. And so I installed them VS Code and Copilot. And then they quickly learned, that they can prompt a Copilot in English and say, hey, what's wrong here with my code? Or they can say, show me what that code looks like in Java, and learn new programming languages, right? Like kids, especially in this, school age, whatever, first to fifth grade or so, they're very eager to explore the world. And as parents, you often see that because they keep asking you questions and you're running out of patience or you're running out of energy and you're like, okay, I explained enough, go and do something else, right? And Copilot doesn't have that problem, right? Like it has infinite patience. You can ask it, you can drive it into insanity by just asking and asking and asking, and at some point you may get garbage, but like it will never stop answering. And I think that's just in itself truly democratizing, right? Because now my kids have the benefit of I know how to code. I taught it myself 30 years ago. I have a technical background, and obviously I'm in this topic day in, day out. But many kids around the world do not have that benefit, and they're living in households where their parents don't know how to code, and they probably have never seen Python or Ruby or whatnot. And so giving them a Copilot that helps them to explore the world of coding and explaining that to them, and they can just say, hey, build me a Pong game or a snake game, or I want to build a little app to track my allowance, things like that, is incredibly empowering. Now, the next thing on this is it doesn't only work in English, it works in effectively any major language, right? And then think about it, a 6-year-old in Germany or in Hyderabad or in Indonesia or whatnot, right? They don't learn English first, they learn the local language first. And then coding is predominantly in English, right? This podcast is in English, and we're yet to get to the point where you can just run AI over this and all our voices sounding exactly like us, and we have different accents or different language, right? And so that is also democratizing, right? Like you can learn coding before learn English, and you can actually ask all these questions without going to the internet and trying to understand what the person has said there, and you can follow up, right? The true power, I think, of these AI chat systems is that they take a second question and a third question. It's like if you didn't get the first answer, you can just say, I don't get it, explain it, or you can say, this sounds wrong to me, and then it apologizes to you, right? Like it's this moment where you're realizing, oh, this is cool, I can probe and see what the true answer is. So I think that will help a whole new generation of kids, and ultimately anyone, right, at any age that wants to get out of read-only mode on their smartphones, right? Like maybe install all these apps, and then we use them in the way that the developer intended, instead of it being custom to us. And then there was a blog post the other week called Personal Software, right? And it derives, I think, Lee Robinson or something. We can look it up later and add to the show notes. But it talks about the personal computer and how the personal computer isn't actually personal, right? Like I'm just downloading all that software that is exactly the same as the software you have, and the only personalization you really have is like the order of the icons in your dock or on your home screen and the background image and whatnot, right? But with AI and tools like GitHub Spark or Bolt.new, Lovable, v0.dev, and so on, you actually can create your own little software, and you don't need to think about buying a subscription and all the other services and the tracking and all the things that come with these apps. I mentioned allowance tracking or weather tracking, or building like a little app when you go on family vacation where you want to collect all your memories, right? Like I think we're heading into an era where people truly just provide apps for themselves that are just for them and their friends or their families. And if once you have achieved that stage, right, then why wouldn't anyone that's using a smartphone also create software for themselves?
Already kind of discussed, but we were on a run yesterday and we're kind of talking about Copilot and just the evolution of these tools. And I kind of probed the question, as these tools get better and the ability for agentic systems to solve issues, go into GitHub repositories, solve those problems, my question was, for the open source community that a lot of these tools rely on, which is, basically saying, hey, we have these issues, let's have the community go solve it. As these agentic systems come and do that, what is the new system for open source? What does that do for the community of developers who are sitting there looking to contribute to this code? If there's already an agentic system that's going to do it for them, does that then, kind of go extinct? What is that shift with the open source community itself? Curious to get your feedback and thoughts on that.
Right, like if you think about open source today, most of us are open source consumers, and we're pulling in a library, or not 1,000 libraries in most of our projects. You can't really do software without open source anymore. And then you have a challenge with one of those libraries. Maybe the behavior is not exactly as you expected, or you need something else that the maintainer didn't have time for. And then often, you fork it and figure it out yourself. And that in itself is already challenging, right? Because now you have to navigate somebody else's code base. And that's a hard problem. Like in many ways, that's an unsolved problem, whether, you dive into an open source project or you join in a new company. It has a different stack, right? Like it maybe have a different version of the programming language or the environment that you're using. So now it's like, oh, do I screw up with my local environment to make that open source project run, right? Like in Ruby, it's like, how much are you messing with RBN and things like that? Or you're just letting it go and hack around it, or just, vendor the code into your own code base. So you're no longer using the open source library, you're just using a local fork of that, right? With, AI, you can navigate the code base much easier, right? Like I already mentioned, you can have it, describe the behavior to you. You can have it, identify the files you want to modify. With agent mode, you can, describe the change you want and see what it does, right? And that alone, is kind of like a learning by doing a behavior that developers will get into, like by describing the thing that you want to achieve in natural language, and then having the agent kind of like identify, okay, I might need to modify these 3 files, and I can still, F5 or run the thing and see, okay, now it throws, 15 error messages, and then you go back to the agent and say, hey, what do I do with all these error messages now here, right? And so that, I think, will get easier as a consumer to become actually a contributor to the open source project, because it's easier to onboard. Then you file a pull request, and, Copilot will review that pull request and point out all the things that you have introduced, bugs, issues, or violations of coding standards against that project. So before, the top maintainer of that project has seen your sloppy work, you might be fast enough to fix all the things, right? Like next human behavior thing here, right? Like, it's like, how much anxiety do I have before I commit back to an open source project because I'm worried, somebody like, Linus Torvalds or with a high rank and status in the community is looking at my code and thinking, what the hell is that? And like, go back and learn coding first. Like, and it's all well-intentioned, right? Like the problem lies as much as with the person that has the fear in the head of contributing back, because most open source projects are actually super friendly, but you don't know that until you have gone and crossed the chasm and actually, taken that step and learned, okay, Logan and Nolan are actually super nice, and they just accept my contributions and whatnot, right? So I think that's where life will get much easier. And then, as I think we are going to get to a stage where instead of me filing an issue, I just use Copilot and an NSV agent to make the change, and then send you back the pull request, and you just use your SV agent to review my work. And then the biggest decision you have to make is, do I want that feature in my library or not? And that still is with you, right? And that's where the software developer still is needed to design the product, because the AI can't do that on their own.
Yeah, one of the you mentioned this example of your kids learning to program in Python, and it reminded me of, I think this year, and obviously Python's been popular for a really long time, but I think this year you announced at GitHub Universe that, like, I don't know if it's tracking the percentage of total code or like new lines of code or what the specific metric is, but like Python is now the world's most popular programming language. It's beating out JavaScript and others. Nolan and I were having this conversation with Charlie Marsh, who created UV and Rough and some Python tooling infrastructure. And the question which we asked him, which I'm really curious to get your reaction to, is like, in this world where AI is so dramatically accelerating, sort of the onboarding of new developers, but also like the existing developers to be more productive, like, is Python the final programming language? Like, are we, like, does it basically stop this like new creation of languages? And I'll plant this separate seed, which is, you and I were originally connected through the work that I was doing in the open source Julia programming language. And it was like pushing on, I was harassing the GitHub team to make sure we had Julia support for all this other stuff, and like, that was my experience growing up, was doing all this work for the Julia ecosystem on GitHub predominantly. So I have a specific, feeling about like what's happening in the world of code generation, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm curious, like, where your head is at in that space, and how you think about that.
I think the ultimate programming language will be human language, whether it's English or German, Hindi, or whatnot. And because that's the layer that we all learn, from birth, and that we express our ideas, right? Like, you're not brainstorming in programming language with Nolan, right? Like on a whiteboard, you're sketching, and it's very kind of like chaotic because human language naturally is that way, right? Like you can put a couple of words on a whiteboard and they have a totally different meaning to you than they may have to me that comes into the meeting room later and looks like this and thinks, what is this, right? And so I think the top layer is going to be human language, and any larger company that has product managers, your product managers are describing all those features in English already, and so we're already at that point. Features are described in English. Support tickets are described in human language. Your pitch decks, all that is human language, right? Programming language is the highest abstraction layer. On top of the CPU or GPU, that's still deterministic, right? That's the difference between those two, right? Like human language inherently is non-deterministic. Like we can say the same sentence, and depending on the context and our background and where we're from, it might mean different things. Programming language, when you put the 5 keywords in a row, that usually mean the same thing. And so we are going to have those two layers, right? The non-deterministic layer and the deterministic layer, and developers will jump back and forth between those. And I think that, whether it's Python or Rust or Go and Ruby, there will be always another programming language. I think anyone predicting the opposite is going to be naturally wrong, because it's in the same way that there used to be always another Twitter client. Now there's no more Twitter clients, but now it's another Mastodon client or Threads or Blue Sky client, right? Like there's always another app that we're trying out because everybody in the tech industry is talking about that app. And so, but I think it's crucial to understand that those two layers have to exist, right? Like a machine learning model at the end of the day needs to translate into programming language. It can do that, at the lowest layer and just run instructions. And we're seeing that already, right? Like when you speak with your phone and instruct it to do things for you, or when you're dictating into ChatGPT, you're not actually having it translate what you say into code first and then execute that code. It just does it because it's built into the application. But with code interpreter, right? Like that's the opposite example. When you use code interpreter or just math in ChatGPT, it writes a Python script first, and then it executes that Python script to get to the result or plot a chart. Anything where the model in itself is worse than just writing code, and then the code does it for it, and all of a sudden you have deterministic outcomes. So I think those two layers will exist, and there isn't a, Python will forever be the top language. And look, these ratings, we publish them every year at GitHub Universe. So what you quoted was Universe 2024. When for the first time Python was the #1 language after, 10 years or so, JavaScript was #2. And obviously the JavaScript ecosystem is divided between JavaScript and TypeScript, and then half of the ecosystem argues, well, if you take JavaScript and TypeScript together, they're still bigger than Python. And sure, that's true, but that wasn't the case last year when JavaScript was #1 and Python was #2, right? So we didn't change the system. It's the same system, and it just shows the trend of the importance of that language. I think on your other question, I think the GitHub in itself and the developer lifecycle will evolve as it had always evolved, right? Like if you go back 30 years when I started coding on a Commodore 64, I had a big yellow book, the big Commodore 64 book or something in German, and I had nowhere to go, right? Like if I was stuck at 6 p.m. on a Saturday and couldn't figure out how to build that side scroller that I always wanted to build, there was nothing I could do. I could just keep looking in the book if there was like a page missing that gave me that insight, or just hack around and see with trial and error whether I can make it work. And then came the internet, and and that changed everything, right? Because you could just, in the early days, you would dial into like a mailbox and chat with some other nerds that were kind of like in your same ecosystem somewhat, because there wasn't really like a single place where all the developers went. And then came SourceForge and GitHub and open source, and all of a sudden you had that world available to you. Where look, what you can do today on a Saturday afternoon is incredible. Just the productivity, right? Like when we ask the question, you haven't asked it, but like when we ask the question, is AI replacing developers? Yeah, we always have done that, right? Like we always have done stuff to make ourselves more productive. If you would, build whatever you're building right now without the power of open source, you would need 10 times as many developers to get the same stuff done. And so you wouldn't be competitive in the market. And so as such, open source, the usage of open source in companies has replaced a part of the workforce that would still be there if we haven't done open source. And the same is true for every technology advancement, for faster computers, from the internet, open source, the cloud, and all, DevOps and all these kind of things. At the same time, the amount of work that we have day in, day out has also increased like exponentially. And we are writing more software every single day, right? Like find a team in any, small or big company that's not writing more code every day than they're deleting, unless, somebody refactors it all. And then you have that one big Git commit where it's like plus 1 million lines of code and minus 2 million lines of code, right? We have all seen that too. But like the reality is we're sitting on an ever-growing pile of code, and often it feels like, pile of shit, let's be clear. That's sometimes the feelings we have, especially when we join a company that has been around, as long as Microsoft or Google have been around, where you're always working in an existing legacy code base. My joke always is the happiest day of a developer is when they start a new project, file a new project. And then from there, it's all downhill, right? Like, because you start with a blank sheet and you try out all these new Python libraries. And then 3 weeks later, you go to your manager and it's like, hey, we have all this tech debt and all this, we made all the wrong choices on these libraries. And this isn't as good as we thought it is. We should start from scratch, right? And so after 3 weeks, you might still be able to do that. After 3 months, you're like, hell no. Now we have to refactor it and make it work and remove all the band-aids that we introduced to ship fast. And so I think AI is helping us a little bit further on that journey to deal with the complexity of our applications and stay sane and ultimately stay in the flow and be creative.
Thomas, you've also emphasized the need for competition in the AI industry. So how does GitHub plan to foster a competitive yet collaborative environment among different AI models, platforms, all within kind of GitHub itself?
We already mentioned multi-model choice, right? Like we added multiple models to Copilot. We will add more, over the months to come. We have a whole catalog of models in GitHub Models. We can, go to the playground and play with Mistral and Cohere and 5.4 and whatnot. If you think about DeepSeek, the DeepSeek model is a GitHub repo. And then links from the GitHub README into Hugging Face, and there you can, look at the data and run inference and whatnot, right? So in many ways, GitHub, not only through the home of open source, it's also now the home of AI, where a lot of these AI projects collaborate. And we're part of an ecosystem. I've always looked at GitHub as, we're one planet in a huge universe of software development tools. There is no one, software development suite that just doesn't exist. Like just look at your computer, you have an operating system and a container solution and an editor, whatever, VS Code. And now there's, lots of forks of VS Code, and that's the nature of open source, right? Like if you don't like the editor, you can fork it and build your own one and see if you can differentiate. And it's this choice, we mentioned already lots of open source libraries, whether it's the Python ecosystem or the React ecosystem. I think, we are still a big Rails shop at GitHub. We've been always working with Ruby and Rails. We're part of the Rails Foundation. And we're part of the Open SSF Foundation and the Linux Foundation and all these kind of things. So I think, we are part of that ecosystem as one planet, and as we want to interact with other planets in our universe, and we want to integrate with them through APIs and webhooks and those kind of things. We partner with them, through joint blog posts, joint conference sessions, or sitting just on the board of these foundations together. And we're giving back to the community, whether it's by just giving everybody free repos and free Copilot and free issues and free actions and whatnot. And by obviously also contributing back to open source ourselves, whether it's in Rails or in Git and other projects. And I think, the best thing about working at GitHub, whether it's me or any other hubber, is that it's really easy to get into a conversation with other developers at GitHub, right? Like our brand is more like a star than a planet, and everybody knows GitHub, and that has good days and bad days, right? Like we get lots of good feedback, and there's also lots of productive productive complaining, I'd say. People saying, why are you doing all this investment into AI instead of investing into that one feature that I always wanted for 3 years? And I'm scratching my head. I'm thinking, well, there's 10,000 features that we wanted to build since 2014, and we, as every other software developer, have an endless backlog of things that we want to build. We have an endless backlog of fundamentals, scale, uptime, accessibility, security, where we want to get better. And we believe that Copilot and agents will help us to bring the effort down, so we can get to the ultimate dream for every developer, which is like, I have this one idea on a morning, and with just a few magical prompts and commandos that can implement all that and show it to you in the evening. Like, how did you do that, right? Like, that's kind of like the dream that we have all in our heads, I think, as software developers.
Yeah, this makes me think of this like 10,000 feature backlog that you all have. At the same time you have that and you want to build all those things into GitHub, and AI is hopefully going to accelerate the process of that. At the same time, we talked before about this like personal software and this like, user of one creation of like text to app, et cetera, with all the products that are doing that. How do you think this like balances out? Like, do you think like, if you had to guess today, if you look like 5 years ahead, does like GitHub end up with 10,000 more features, or like does GitHub end up with like actually like a sprawling product array that is like some of those like actually distinctly live outside of the current GitHub flow because like they're relevant? Yeah. Or like or more generally, like does software become like 100x more complicated, or do we end up with like 100x like more different software to choose from in the next 5 years?
I think it's both. I think, in some ways it becomes more complicated because the depth is increasing so much. We're already seeing that. I have the AI engineering book here. I've been, looking at this and reading through some of the pages and understanding, how full stack engineering has fundamentally changed with the AI models. Not for everybody yet, but we're heading into that direction where you now have to also understand, prompt engineering and evals and responsible AI and filters and then, model upgrades and moving from one model version to another. And that's not as easy as moving from one open source library version to another, although that's often, harder as we'd like it to be as well. And so I think the world is going to be more complex, but at the same time, through the help of Copilot chat interfaces, being able to just talk, and I think we're heading to a place where I just have a Jarvis like Iron Man in my ear, where I can just reflect on some of my thoughts, and it gives me like, oh, yesterday we were on that podcast and you said this and that, and maybe that's a good talk track for this customer meeting as well, to just use a non-coding example. And so I think the agents and the copilots that we're building, plus the natural language interface, will allow us to navigate that complexity easier, right? Like, and the classic example I think of agents that we all have in our head is the travel agent, where I can just say, hey, book me, my spring break trip with my family, same wife, same kids. So you don't have to go to an airline webpage and enter from two dates and birth dates and names and all that. And you go to the rental car company and to the hotel webpage. All that again for the exact same spring break trip you take every single year, right? Like, or it's the same family but different destination, but it knows that, okay, you like the beach and you like kind of like warm weather in April and whatnot. So I think that's a very simplistic example, but it imagine the amount of time you have, for a 4-person family. Every year you book your 2-3 vacations that you're taking. Now you have your AI assistant that does it all for you, and it's really just a visual choice of, okay, this or this option, or maybe it's a pricing choice, or whatever criteria you have to pick your vacation. I think that's, if you take this example and multiply that across all the decisions we have to make in life, and realize that human language interfaces are much more easy to interact with than click and mouse and user interfaces or touch screens. I think we're looking into a life where we navigate all the complexity with much more ease and happiness.
Thomas, we like to leave our guests with 2 questions as we wrap things up. First one is, what does your personal tech stack look like? What tools are you currently using day in and day out?
GitHub. So we have this, saying at GitHub that we build GitHub on GitHub using GitHub. So there's it's not a joke. I open GitHub in the morning. I look through my notifications. My leadership team posts, their status updates in the GitHub discussion. We have obviously lots of issues where decisions are made on business planning, pricing, or features. We are heavy users of Slack, and so that's probably my number 2 tool after GitHub, looking into Slack. And my favorite channel is the demos channel, where folks post their demos and just looking through the recent demos and what they're working on. And it's like a widespread of this is shipping tomorrow, all the way back to this is designer prototyping something that's not shipping for a while. VS Code, when I get time and do some coding myself. What else? I have ChatGPT. I use that as well, especially the new reasoning models and kind of like describing what I want to solve, and just give me a starting point. To write a strategy document, or just a quick email to somebody where I don't know how to get started, and have it in a succinct way. I'm English as a second, have English as a second language, and so sometimes it's just easy. And even that, goes back to the question I asked earlier, which is, how is this changing the world, and how do we get, 2 billion developers? I think, we're actually going to get to a world that's much more literate and has an easier time to write a professional text and engage in professional conversation.
Awesome. And then last question is, now we're 40 some days into 2025. We like to ask our guests, what's one thing you hope happens in 2025 and one thing you hope does not happen come 2025?
I think what I don't want to happen, as a CEO of GitHub, is another Log4j security incident. And in some ways, those will happen again. But every time we have these on a Friday afternoon or not, it creates a big wave for a lot of developers around the world to rally and fix all their servers and all their stacks. And so the more we get to a point where we have secured the open source ecosystem, the better we all can sleep at night. And so I think that's one thing that we're really pushing hard at GitHub, together with a lot of partners in the ecosystem, and where I hope the farther out the next big one of those is, the better it is for all of us. I think what I want to happen in 2025 is that we make progress on what we talked about for the last 1 hour, which is like getting to a spot where these SWE agents, these agentic systems, these copilots get better at interpreting my intent and helping me to write good software, because that allows me to build more cool stuff. Both at GitHub through my 1,000+ engineers in the company, but also me personally when I have time over the weekend to code with my kids or on my own hobby projects. Right? I'm I've been a developer since the early 90s, a professional developer since the early 2000s, and the dream is still there, that you have all these ideas in your head, and the thing that we don't have is enough time to implement them all. And so that's, I think, if we get a little bit closer to that in 2025, where we can just describe with a few prompts of what we want to build, and then the AI helps us building that and brings back the joy in coding and removing a little bit of the boilerplate or the things you don't want to do, we've made a step forward as industry.
I love that. Thomas, this was awesome. This was a wonderful conversation. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us about the present, the future, and everything in between.